It's a ghoulish week here on Dr. J's Movie Imaginarium podcast. We are doing the horror genre, fitting as Halloween is coming up soon, and this is the frightened scare month of the year. Almost everybody's favorite holiday, Halloween. And what a great time to watch spooky, frightening films as the weather starts getting colder and the nights start getting longer. And the wind howling down from the plains here in northwest Kansas brings about some frightening backdrops to what is a veritable American film genre, the horror genre. Not always so celebrated, not always so rich in meaning. And that's one of the things that I want to look at today in our movie podcast. We're going to take a fairly close look at a couple of horror films of the American tradition that really inaugurate and lay the foundation for the modern horror genre. Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero, the zombie classic. And we're going to speak about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper from the early 1970s. Or I guess mid-70s, right, Dr. Dan? Hello, Dr.
1974.
Dan. 1974, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But before we do, I want to cut back and look historically at the American horror genre. And what it means and what it signifies toward our cultural expressions. And I think one of the interesting ends here is to discuss postmodernity and the age of neoliberalism. So in this kind of, in what postmodernity, I think, suggests is a post-truth world, a post-enlightenment world, a world in which there is, in the words of Lyotard, an incredulity toward meta-narratives, right? Pushing back against. I think the horror genre, though, signifies a couple of different problems and wrinkles within this. A question here, are oppositional modes of thought and artistic expression, non-mainstream, oppositional modes of artistic expression, are they still possible with the rise and dominance of our mainstream culture today? Or are these modes rendered obsolete by a false dichotomous relationship between core cultural practices and the periphery? 1 decade and now 2 decades into the 21st century, we find ourselves in an age of discredited postmodernity and the benighted mastery of mass culture. Mass culture reigns supreme. Lyotard's incredulity toward meta-narratives elicits little incredulousness in our world today. If postmodernity signaled the anxieties and critiques of the modernist project and the rationalizing totality and mastery at its foundation, as we have seen since the late 1980s, a return to the telos of mastery, only more heightened and totalizing than before. Postmodernism has been replaced in this sense with a kind of most modernism, and the rise of mass culture, a kind of flattened cultural environment in which most of the oppositional modes are even produced right in the center of our culture, and there is this almost universal celebration of the mass of mass culture. I think the horror genre in the studio age was a realm of America's cultural subaltern, and this is, I think, where the horror genre is really interesting to look at with this development and evolution of culture in America and the relationship between high culture, low culture, and then subsequently mass culture. The horror genre in the studio era was indeed part of the cultural subaltern, low-budget B pictures with little production value and limited distribution. Yes, you had Hollywood studio or Universal Studios in the 1930s. You had some of the great classics of our horror genre. Universal Studios was part of the Little Five. They couldn't compete with the big three, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount and the big heavy hitters, and Fox in production and distribution and of big budget films. So they had to develop a niche market, a way of making some money and a way of positioning themselves as unique and strong players in the American motion picture film industry. And that niche market that they developed was the horror genre in the 1930s. The Universal was well suited to do this. Carl Laemmle headed Universal, and Universal was one of the first film studios in American film history to have in-house makeup and special effects. They did all of this in-house. Universal was very much a family studio, personified by Carl Laemmle, who basically hired all of his relatives. A lot of people were related to each other who worked in Universal, and they were very vertically integrated and tightly knit, this studio. They did everything in-house. They didn't contract out a lot in order to save money. So in-house makeup and special effects was very conducive to the sort of show the monster approach of the Universal horror genre. They attempted to contract creative European and American talent to make these low-budget fright pictures, ushering in the first age of American horror film. James Whale, an English director, a creative auteur from England, infused his horror movies with camp humor, sexual energy, and complex symbolism in directing such classics as Frankenstein from 1931, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, The Invisible Man from 1933, and one of my favorites, The Old Dark House from 1932. But these pictures were always perceived as having limited cultural value, despite sometimes making Carl Laemmle's Universal some impressive profits. Irving Thalberg, head of production at MGM and known as the Prince of Hollywood, once described horror pictures as degrading and embarrassing product that without sound ideas behind them. Right?
It's similar to the Scorsese beef with superhero movies.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which I'm partial to his critique of that. And there's long been, and I think American film history, we find examples today with the superhero comic book movies that so proliferate our contemporary film market. Also the CGI talking animals of the kids movie. Pretty much guaranteed to make $350 million, right? A CGI talking animal. They're profitable films. A big demographic are children audiences for contemporary Hollywood movies. And they're often sort of decried and criticized as lacking in any kind of robust ideas or meaning. The horror genre of the classic Hollywood era was very much in this camp. Pun intended, camp. I'll get to that in a moment. Talk more about camp. So, these were often sort of bad taste movies without much of meaning behind them. And, sort of movies that played with both fright and scare, but also humor and camp and other sort of subversive energies that go on. In the 1940s, RKO Studios, another one of the Little Five studios, sought to capitalize on Universal's success. Universal, up until that time, had basically owned the horror genre market, but RKO tries to get into the game as well, releasing their own spate of horror fare, many directed by a French filmmaker, Jacques Tournier. Now, these are often regarded as classics of the genre. Tournier directed Cat People, I Walk with a Zombie, which I think we'll mention very briefly when we talk about zombie culture here in a moment, and The Leopard Man. Of these, Cat People was a pretty big financial success, but the others did poor to average business at the box office. Serious critics and industry titans who tried to hold up the cinema as a legitimate art of the 20th century often discredited these low-budget scare pictures. With post-war industry consolidation and the threat from television looming, the horror genre went deeper into America's cultural subaltern. Now, there are some notable exceptions, like Hitchcock's 1960 triumph Psycho, the only horror picture, by the way, that Hitchcock ever really did. You might count The Birds. The Birds is kind of marginal horror, but Psycho is pretty straight-up horror. Also, the most profitable film Hitchcock ever did. Psycho made Hitchcock more money than any other movie he ever made. Those are exceptions. For the most part, in the 50s and the 1960s, horror really reached a low ebb, or viewed in a totally different light, a kind of camp high-water mark. A low ebb in industry influence and distribution and production value, exemplified by those stupendous failures of Ed Wood Jr., those trash masterworks like Plan 9 from Outer Space from 1959, which reaches new depths of awe-inspiring futility. These horror films often had few scares. They were often heavy in dialogue and a heavy presence at America's drive-in movie theaters. By 1967, the horror genre was relegated to independent cinema, where Vincent Price and Roger Corman, among others, tried their best to make quality films with limited budgets, limited talent, and little attention. But 1967 was a crucial year of transition, a year that saw the counterculture movement in America explode onto the national scene. A group of amateur filmmakers from Pittsburgh, calling themselves the Image 10, were able to scrape up enough money, about $115,000 at the time, to make a movie in an abandoned farmhouse north of Pittsburgh. The film, Night of the Living Dead, would go on to revolutionize the zombie form, change the American film industry, and influence the trajectory of mass culture and its opposition. In its text, one can discern the promises and anxieties of postmodernity. In its reception, it is the signal of postmodern's downfall and the rise of popular culture. In its zombie terror is the symbolic threat of destructive neoliberal capitalism, which renders human beings a new species altogether, Homo economicus, the hollowed-out, catonic capitalist consumer, just mindlessly consuming, that has colonized the identity of America's citizen subject. The neoliberal subject of the 21st century is a zombie subject, and to trace its historical development, one must return to the origins of mass culture's triumph over the postmodern, to a film that played at the MoMA and the Waverly simultaneously, to the first zombie invasion of America's ideal. So let's get into it a little bit. Night of the Living Dead and the triumph of mass culture. Well, Night of the Living Dead inaugurates a new form of the horror genre, but also crucially, it marks a transformation in the audience reception to the horror film. Its popularity was almost immediate. This was a big hit right out of the box. Everybody loved it. And as Ben Hervey in his BFI film classic on Night describes it, it was a film that profoundly collapsed the distinction between high and low culture to such an extent that it did as much to dismantle cultural hierarchies as Leslie Fielder and Susan Sontag. Its simultaneous highbrow, lowbrow status set the tone for the 1970s midnight screenings where Cocteau rubbed shoulders with Ed Wood Jr. Night is a dark and unforgiving film in which all the main characters die gruesomely. This is not a horror picture from the past. This is a new and modern horror picture, and it's dark, it's gruesome, there's flesh eating involved, nobody survived. The movie terrified children so much on its initial release that it became instrumental in the development of the MPAA rating system, spurred on by Roger Ebert's famous attack of its exhibition from his Chicago Sun-Times review. Ebert, this is a terrific review, and it really does, I think, also allow Ebert to ascend to the ranks of a national film critic. He watched Night of the Living Dead as a daytime matinee screening, and this was often how horror movies would come out. They come out as matinee pictures. If it was approved by the code, it was approved for general audiences. There were no distinctions being made between particular audiences that some movies in the classic Hollywood era before 1967, 68, some movies are more adult fare, others are more children fare. It was up to individuals and individual families, parents rather, to determine whether or not their kids could go see a movie. A horror movie was never really considered outside the purview of a children's audience because horror films were so kind of campy. And yeah, there maybe were some scares and some frights, but they were generally few and far between, and there were movies not to be taken too seriously. So when Night of the Living Dead opened nationwide, it opened on matinee shows on a Saturday afternoon with 7, 8, 9-year-old kids in the audience getting ready and excited like they always had been to watch another horror movie. Well, I just love picturing Ebert in this environment, a young Roger Ebert sitting down in a darkened movie theater surrounded by children who are all kind of very anxious and excited. And what he saw was real terror from these kids as this movie starts playing. I mean, this movie is not a children's film at all. And very quickly, the music, the ambiance, the cinematography, it's black and white like a 50s science fiction movie, but it's somehow of a starker realism of black and white. It's like a television black and white. This movie, one of the effective elements of this film was it evoked television realism and newscast realism. There are several scenes in the movie with actual newscasters talking about the flesh eaters, the ghouls. Yeah. George Romero did this very consciously, of course, because TV was still black and white back then.
Yeah, kind of that medium cool, where it did the same sort of thing. It's the idea it's a documentary and not just a movie.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got this stark, terrified realism, right? And as Roger Ebert writes, these children sitting in the audience could not protect themselves from the dread and the fear that they felt. At one point, Ebert looks over, and there was a 8-year-old little girl sitting a few seats away from him. She's very excited at the beginning of this movie, and midway through the film, Ebert looks over. He describes this in his review. She's quietly crying and trembling as this movie is played out. And these kids were just terrified. Well, Ebert's review dealt a lot more with the audience than it did with the actual substance of the film. And he really does, in some ways, his review, which was very popular and very talked about at the time, leads to one of the downfalls of the production code and the rise of the MPAA rating system. PG-13 doesn't come out yet. That's in the 70s. That actually comes out with Jaws. Jaws was one of the films that sort of spurs on the PG-13 rating. Jaws was a movie that kind of skirted the line a little bit. It was legitimately terrifying, but it required a kind of new category in a way, that teenagers, it's acceptable for teenagers, but below the age of 13, maybe not, right? But as the MPA first comes out, it's G, PG, and X rating was actually a popular designation at the time. There was a film that won an Oscar for Best Picture that was X-rated. Can you think of the only X-rated film to win?
Midnight Cowboy.
Midnight Cowboy, yeah. Very good. Yeah, had an X rating mostly for profanity, also some sexual content. But now we use that NC-17 designation. It's much more of a designation about nudity and sex as opposed to profanity or violence. This has always been much talked about, of course, is why Hollywood is so quick to censor sex and a lot less willing to censor violence. Even from the origins of American cinema, way back into the silent era, violence was always much more accessible and visible on the American movie screen as opposed to sexuality. Some folks like to chalk this up to our Puritan roots and values in American culture, that we're always a lot more afraid of sex than we are of violence. There's some truth to that. There's also, I think, with the development of the production code, they relied very heavily on psychological studies at the time, scientific psychological studies. And some of those studies suggested that, for example, violence on the movie screen only influences the so-called criminal mind, or the mind disposed toward violence, right? Whereas it doesn't incite a more general threat of mimicry in the general audience. So the average sort of non-criminal mind is not going to be influenced by violent content, whereas sexualized content can influence us all because we're all sort of sexual beings. So this literature went. This is all kind of, sort of hack literature from psychological studies done in the 1920s, 1930s. But the movie men in the rise of the classic era, they took this stuff seriously. And they said, well, and I think this is probably good reason to censor sexuality and sex a lot more so than violence. So Night was a different kind of horror movie. The terrors no longer were simply atmospheric and sort of distant and foggy and generalized and subtextual. The screams were no longer out of delight. These children were screaming out of true terror. And if children were terrified by Night, teenagers were ecstatic. This was finally a real good reason to go and watch a horror movie. Before, the horror fare of the 1950s made for good drive-in fare because, of course, the drive-in movie theater audience, not a lot of them were paying attention to the movies, if you know what I mean. Other things were going on. But now here was a good reason for teenagers to find some meaning and some gravitas, if you will, in the American horror genre. In the words of film theorist Robin Wood, Night tapped into a teenager's nightmare wish to smash the norms that oppress them, right? The suburban American norms, the small town values, the private sphere, the familial and private sphere. Young adult audiences delighted in the destruction of a traditional American farmhouse, set with its elegant dining table, its knickknacks on the mantle, pictures of a stoic family on the wall. In fact, George Romero, director of Night of the Living Dead, admitted that during the production of the film, the cast and the crew took devious pleasure in the house's destruction. The house that they were filming in was recently abandoned, and it was slated for demolishing. So the Image 10 crew, they could be as destructive as they wanted to be with this set. They could just tear it all to shreds. And they very much enjoyed doing so. Interestingly enough, too, they slept in the farmhouse. They had a lot of expensive film equipment, and they didn't want to leave it unattended. And so during the shoot, they would sleep in this. They would be destroying the farmhouse and filming it during the day and sleeping there at night. And I think that's a good touch for a classic horror film. The 1950s American dream was just obliterated piece by piece by George Romero, who he grew up in this kind of world and this environment. He grew up in a very kind of privileged and comfortable suburban Cleveland upbringing, and felt that this upbringing was very oppressive to him. And so, Night of the Living Dead has these very powerful resonances, and I think they connect very well to the counterculture moment of this time as well. The counterculture moment is fascinating in one respect, which is that this generation, the baby boomer generation, that forms the bulk of the youthful counterculture moment, was probably one of the most privileged and well-off generations in American history.
And it was. They grew up on American socialism.
Yeah, exactly.
The welfare state.
Yeah, the New Deal, post-war flourishing of prosperity. This is the world that they knew, and they rejected it so emphatically. And that, I think, cuts to the very definition of what counterculture is. Counter, right, to mainstream culture. Oppositional to mainstream culture, counter to Reader's Digest and Walter Cronkite, right? In rejecting certain established forms of, for example, political participation, right? The counterculture movement did not translate into a whole bunch of new people getting elected to Congress or new laws being passed. In fact, that was LBJ's Great Society. It was partly some of the things that they were rejecting, maybe not specific policies, right? Like the Voting Rights Act, or the expansion of Medicaid or something like that. But it was the whole phalanx, the whole environment, the institutional environment, the mainstream norms, what we might also call American pluralism, this era of sort of center-left and center-right agreement and consensus on how to run the country, right? Eisenhower doesn't roll back the New Deal. LBJ pursues all of these projects and has tremendous amount of congressional institutional support in doing it. But the young generation just rejects all of this. It's a fascinating historical moment. And I think that Night of the Living Dead is a film that resonates along these lines. It's an independent picture, very low budget, but received some tremendous reviews and tremendous support. Not just counterculture and opposition culture. And here's the big takeaway, I think. At the same time that it was part and parcel of this rejection of mainstream, Night of the Living Dead was also being hailed as an art house masterpiece on both sides of the Atlantic. Early on in its run, Elliot Stein from Sight and Sound convinced some MoMA curators at the Museum of Modern Art curators to accompany him to a screening of Night at an authentic 42nd Street flea pit, its natural habitat, right, with the marijuana smoke really thick in the audience, right? 42nd Street in Midtown Manhattan used to have all of these kind of seedy movie theaters of the old classic, and these form the bulk of the sort of 70s midnight viewings in New York City, right? So he convinces all these curators and these high-minded, highbrow artistes to go and see the natural habitat, the barbaric, environment of the uncivilized, and watch this movie, Night of the Living Dead. What they saw was an incredibly tight film, 1,100 cuts in a mere hour and a half. We were talking about this earlier today, Dr. Dan, that post-production cutting is very labor-intensive process, right? You sit in a room and you cut and you cut and you cut and you cut. And there's, for most filmmakers, especially independent filmmakers who are cutting their own picture, there's no real definitive end to the cutting. You could keep going and going and going. There has to be a point where you just sort of decide to stop, right? Because cutting is such a refined editing down a film, there's always something to edit. Night of the Living Dead, if you watch this film from an editing perspective, it's phenomenal, the amount of cutting and the amount of hours they put into this. George Romero just would not let it go. He just kept cutting and cutting and cutting. Days bled into weeks, bled into months. In fact, this picture is a 1967 picture, but it doesn't really hit audiences at all until 1968, right? Because it took so long, the post-production process, and then to find distributors and everything else. But 1,100 cuts in an hour-and-a-half long picture is pretty impressive. It was a low-budget shocker, but with high-budget man-hours. It was quickly scheduled for regular screenings at the Museum of Modern Art, where wine-drinking intellectuals discussed its significance for the breakdown of the American family in the Vietnam War. Of course, the pot-smoking counterculture youth at drive-ins and flea pits across the country were discussing similar themes. As Hervey writes, frustrations and anxieties of America's youth were exercised in Night, where in their inability to transform America, the ghouls vented the desire to pulverize society and rupture order, especially the reality they assault that seems so anachronistically 1950s, just out of touch, out of place. Amidst the thick pot smoke and ominous night music, young audiences cheered on the zombie horde, screaming, "Eat them! I'm a flesh eater!" at the screen, and then marauding through the streets afterwards, gnawing on bones. It seems this low-budget film, made in opposition to the Hollywood industry, horror genre expectations, mainstream culture, and a kind of liberal vision of the American dream, started to become accepted on a massive scale. And this is this kind of ways in which mass culture comes out of the debris and ruins of opposition, postmodernity, the slow drip of neoliberalism and toward full neoliberal culture. Those who celebrated Night, however, saw themselves outside the mainstream very often. But the horror genre industry quickly changed. After Night of the Living Dead, horror franchises become increasingly common, and Hollywood invested in booming franchises such as Friday the 13th franchise, Halloween with Michael Myers, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something of a franchise, I think. There's such a weird distinction between the first one and the second one in the 1980s. How did those on the margins come to constitute the identity of the center? Well, Night of the Living Dead is a microcosm of this larger counterculture movement shift toward commoditization and popular identification. One of the founding tenets of the counterculture age was that it ran counter, as I said before, to mainstream organs like television, like Reader's Digest, like large circulation newspapers. The failure of the counterculture moment, and I do think there are significant political failures to the counterculture moment, and the failure of the project of postmodernity, for that matter, laid the groundwork for the rise of popular culture, of mass culture and its celebration. It is important here to point out that popular culture's dominance in the service of capitalism, while the counterculture movement and the aesthetic and intellectual commitments of postmodernism are not in particular in the service of capitalism. So there is a distinction. Oppositional modes are no longer durable in an environment of increasing capitalist consumption, particularly in an age defined by a neoliberalism. By neoliberalism, I refer to the increasing financialization of the economy, but also the tendency of economic rationality to influence and constitute other non-economic human practices. And indeed, human identities themselves become part and parcel of economic thinking, of economic rationalization. The human as an entrepreneurial homo economicus, right? Homo economicus, I think that's a made-up term. In which we increasingly sort of we view almost every aspect and perspective of our lives through economic rationalization. In such an environment, aesthetic or intellectual commitments are either commoditized or resold from society's center, or they're rejected outright. Much of the art house film circuit, for example, has effectively withered away since the 1980s. And from a cultural high in the 60s and 70s, when European cinema began to change Hollywood in its own country here in the United States of America, we live in very different times now. As D.A. Miller writes, popular culture has become more oppressive than elite culture ever was, indicating the ways in which elite culture of the past was always content to have lowbrow parallel culture for those who are uncultured, of which the cinema, motion pictures, was always a part. Motion pictures always struggled with this designation of being lowbrow, at very best sort of middle-class fare. And I think this is where the rise of auteur theory comes from. With Andrew Saris at the New York Times, auteur theory develops in the 1960s as a way in which to say, basically, if you are a high-cultured form of art, you need an author. And so who's the auteur, who's the author of a film? And auteur theory, identifies the director as that author, right? Now, there's always a bit of a fiction, I think, to auteur theory in film, because it really belies all of the kind of teamwork and the complexity. Where's the screenwriter in auteur theory? Where's the crew, the cinematographer, post-production editing, an art in and of itself? What role and agency does an actor who's in front of the camera have in shaping the meaning of the film, right? Auteur theory has to sort of simplify all this and say it's just the director, right? It's the vision of the director. And I think there are more auteur films there are some films that are more auteur than others. I've always thought a classic example is Hitchcock. Hitchcock is an auteur in the sense that you watch a Hitchcock picture, if you know anything about Hitchcock, it's like, yeah, that's a Hitchcock picture. I can see that, right? There's something distinctive about his style. I think a contemporary filmmaker who is very auteur is Quentin Tarantino. You see a Tarantino movie, it's kind of easy to identify it as a Tarantino movie, right? Would you say, Dr. Dan, and maybe some other auteurs out there in our contemporary film universe?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Kubrick. Was it the Paul Anderson?
Wes Anderson, who does the...
Well, Wes Anderson, but...
that's a good example.
What's the...
P.T. Anderson, yeah, Paul Thomas Anderson.
Yeah, Paul Thomas Anderson.
Yeah.
His movies, I think you can start it in the middle and kind of figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are threads that run through, even as early pictures like Hard Eight, Boogie Nights, There Will Be Blood, The Master. I think that there are themes and there are cinematographic touches and visual touches that bind together. Although I would say Wes Anderson is much more of an auteur in some ways. I mean, there is such a distinctive style of like artifice for artifice's sake. The over the top acting, contrivances. Wes Anderson is truly a filmmaker of contrivances. The sets are fake; they're fully contrived. The acting is fully contrived. Right? There's this fakey, wonky, postmodern style to Wes Anderson films that I also think Tarantino has to a certain degree. There are contrivances throughout in Tarantino movies. Those are, I think, very often much more viscerally related to the body and the human body, like excesses of violence and such in Tarantino movies, which are like really kind of over the top, campy and contrived, but that fit along with the trajectory of American horror genre. So popular culture has become more oppressive than any elite culture ever was, at least with the distinction between high and low culture. High elite culture could accommodate lowbrow material. But mass culture today is increasingly intolerant of oppositional modes, a concentration of aesthetic commitments that can be understood through the historical rise of neoliberal capitalism. In a global economy that requires mass consumerism, cultural practices must be flattened and organized for efficiency. Adversarial stances can be tolerated only in style and appearance, but not in substance. And so it is that as postmodernity withers, popular culture triumphs. It is on the terrain of neoliberalism in which these trajectories are to be understood. And Night of the Living Dead, I would suggest to you all, is a roadmap for this terrain. Night endures because it emerged at a crucial moment in American culture and society, but also because within its text, one can see the dangers of the neoliberal paradigm. And it is to this issue that we should now turn. And I call these the neoliberal fever dreams within Night of the Living Dead. Night begins in a cemetery. Its narrow road, its small American flags along the slope. The undead necessarily emerge from the everyday. That tall figure in a cut suit, pale, pockmarked, he shuffles in proximity and appears more worn the closer and closer, as if the decay of some terror. he emerges on our two characters, brother and sister, unexpectedly, in such a way that he looms over the audience as well. There is no lead-up to this initial attack, no warning, no indication of what this monstrous thing might be. The brother, Johnny, jumps in front of the ghoul to save his sister, but he is quickly felled as his head thuds against a tombstone. The chase begins. The fever dream of the marauding undead begins. From here on out, the film has little respite from the zombie onslaught. Barbara, the sister, escapes to the car, rolls it downhill, races toward an idyllic farmhouse nestled in the western Pennsylvania countryside. Here she stays until her own gruesome demise. The Zombie Imaginarium is the fertile ground on which mass culture is reconciled, and through which its triumph is to be interrogated. It is the internalized other, fractured along the seams of a colonized identity. Early in the onslaught, Barbara wanders around the living room, comes upon and triggers a music box. The doors of the carousel open as the thing rotates, and through which her face is seen. Here's an inside of the movie particular. It is a calm fragment that punctures the shell. That macabre inside, an embryonic mucus, it necessarily toils. Night is a look into the internal self, those interiors that are boarded up, blocked off, and defended against the encroaching other. One can see Barbara's eyes full of shock and terror through those revolving doors. This image is a visual cue to the house she is enclosed in. It indicates not only the propertied house within us, but the house of America that we are caged within. In the era of neoliberalism, time has swallowed the human. The sorties of rational mechanization have carpet-bombed not only the life processes of workers and others in the economic sphere, but every aspect of the human experience. The ruins of virtue, of irrational and organic, of the unitary human being, have been raised and replaced with the fragmentation of modernity, systematized, rational. And so it is in this America called the world. Lockean reification imagines life as a house, propertied and illuminated from within. But the rituals of liberalisticism, as much a mystical idea as a rational one, demand to be attacked on the margins of things. Brain eaters, shuffling about on the lawn, just outside. In one sense, the zombie horde is the egoless collective obsessed with consuming the individual. But in another sense, the brain-eating masses are the touchstone of the automatons inside, those boarding up the house with a desperate application of order. But the insatiable undead can never be fully buried. Their final resting is not the telos of capitalism. Rather, the purpose of capitalism resides in colonizing the submissive and singular logic of the zombie mind. Capitalism as brain eater, capitalism as machine man. Then the world settles down to its fate, and we hail the undead as masters of the earthly realm. So the monsters of the horror genre, Dr. Dan, the monsters of the horror genre signify a lot of really important things in our culture, from the universal monsters of Frankenstein, of the Wolfman, of Dracula, to our more modern monsters of the zombies, of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, of Freddy Krueger, and of Michael Myers. What are some of the things that these monsters signify in our culture today? What do they mean to us? Why are they so important to us?
Well, I think some of it is, goes back to the carnival, right? Hundreds of years ago.
The grotesque.
Yeah, so and it's the one day you can make fun of the king and get away with sort of that. And then you have Carnival in the New World, which does a similar feat where the enslaved for one day can take shots at the master, the plantation owners. And so for me, it seems like, horror, I think there's a libidinal component to it. There's a very deep component that, I particularly don't like horror movies because of this sort of the terror involved in sort of in the aftermath. I think it's in the aftermath of it, having nightmares, having to think about what you just saw. I remember seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacre with a bunch of friends when I was like 15, and it's just horrifying. And then I think we watched The Hills Have Eyes, those 70s realistic, nothing supernatural is going on. It's just the grotesque, incestuous family eating people. And, but I think it operates on, I think in terms of multiple levels, I think, obviously the Frankenstein movies, this idea of science gone wrong.
Science is, of course, the problem in Frankenstein, right?
Yeah.
As I like to ask my students, who made the monster? Dr. Frankenstein, yeah, but who really made the monster? Science. Science is the enemy in Frankenstein. I've always thought that there was an interesting anti-science element to the horror genre, and also the science fiction genre, of course. You think of HAL 9000, right, in this 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? Science and technological development of scientific things and artificiality is often the threat to humanity, right? Is often our biggest danger. I like what you say about the monster, that there's this sort of, it shatters the norms, it shatters the orders, the rationality, and the political authority as well. An opportunity for us to revel in something that has the taste of revolution to it, if only for a brief moment. I think that goes back to the concern that I began with here, is, are these oppositional modes in artistic expression, are they still viable? Or have we reached a place where now the collapse of high culture and low culture is, I think, totally complete in a way? I think there are little instances of elite culture sort of remaining in a hierarchical space relative to sort of middle class or lowbrow culture. Now, I could be wrong about that. I guess that's the first question to ask you, Dr. Dan. Like, do you see cultural hierarchies as still salient and visible? And if not, what happens to this oppositional order-smashing order of things within art, within film, within horror?
And I think, again, like with horror, the 20s and 30s moment, it's post-colonial. And so the horror in that is also, especially from, people of European descent before World War II especially, there is the horror of the colonized, the formerly enslaved, coming into their homes and slitting their throats, right? That was always the nightmare.
The great fear of the slaveocracy was to wake up in the middle of the night with your slave and a bloodied axe standing at the end of your bed.
The Haitian Revolution, and you always have, the offset, the outgrowth of the Haitian Revolution, the fear of voodoo, and even in the James Bond movie from '73, Live and Let Die, they play on that. Like, I remember as a kid, I was like, oh my gosh, voodoo. There was a horror element to that one James Bond movie that was connected to this space of blackness in the Caribbean that has this history of British colonialism and all that sort of thing. But I think it also goes back to that libidinal, right? I think the libidinal component, right, that the fear of the sexuality, like, you're talking about the Puritan moment, right? Because the other outgrowth of that, if the Puritans wanted to push back the sexual urge, there's also the necessity for the violent urge of settler colonialism. And so when we think of film and the history of allowing violence, a lot of that comes from, like when you watch violence, you're preparing to defend the homeland versus the censoring of, nudity and sex for sort of, which I would consider like a disciplining, like that Foucault, the disciplining of the ranks in order to fight the wars. Right. I think by the time Night of the Living Dead, you can't say that it's not hitting the same elements. I'm sure you could find someone that could say that some of these movies from the 30s are just as, scary as, say, Night of the Living Dead.
Sure. Even
though the contexts are completely changed. So like with Night of the Living Dead, you have the silent majority, because everyone's, for the most part, it's all the zombies are white. They're often in suits. And the only thing that makes them zombies is they're kind of moving slow and they have that, zombie look on their face.
Let's talk about the zombies in particular
Yeah.
a little bit. Coded in the zombie codes of American culture. Zombies, and you touch upon this directly with regards to Caribbean. The original zombie iterations, like with I Walked with a Zombie from RKO, zombies were always coded as like these Caribbean, racialized, thoroughly racist portrayals of voodoo hypnotized others, sexually threatening white women in particular. That's like the main theme of I Walked with a Zombie.
Horror moment.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. And I Walked with a Zombie is kind of the standard bearer of this zombie iteration, but Night of the Living Dead is a brand new kind of zombie. This is I think there's like this sort of desexualized energy from the zombies, and they are suddenly coded as white. And gone are some of the racial hierarchies and sexual tensions, but what remains, I think, are some of the class anxieties.
Yeah, the business attire. Like the zombies are wearing 50s business attire.
Yeah, yeah, or like a flower printed dress, for the female zombies or whatever. And so they're sort of everyday people, upper middle class white folks who have been stricken with the zombie disease, if you will. But it's sort of like they constitute the masses in a way. They constitute this sort of like this class threat and instantiate certain class anxieties that I think have carried all the way through to a certain degree. Our modern zombie now is a threat of the masses, mindless. There's no ego. They don't coordinate with each other and work with each other. They just keep coming at you in waves, right? They don't even like plan how to get into the house. There's no like strategic planning involved. They just come in waves and mindless. I think I mentioned to you earlier today, as long as you put like a treadmill up and the zombie gets on the treadmill, it's just going to keep going. It's not even going to realize it's not making any progress.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is always really sharply contrasted to another undead in the horror genre, the vampire, and the tradition of the vampire. The vampire has those class anxieties and maintains, I think, a very sharp sexualized coding. But the vampire is like the threat from above. Vampires generally walk alone and are lone figures. They're intellectuals. They penetrate the psychology as much as they do the physical body of their victims, right? They terrorize in a psychological sense. There's no way in which one can board up the house to escape the
You're
vampire.
seduced by the vampire because if they don't tear your neck out, if the bite can give you eternal life.
Yeah.
And so there's that seduction.
Yeah. There's definitely a seduction element to it. Whereas the zombies is like sort of, just like the egoless consumption of the flesh.
Yeah.
With no redeemable reward to it.
Yeah, very 20th century, right? The fear of the masses.
Yeah. And I've seen, I think, maybe we have moved. It's now 2010. When I started teaching about zombies and vampires, it was about 2009. And a decade ago, I think that these tropes were much more salient to our young generation. That, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and kind of, what's that? There's another TV show that I'm missing here.
Walking Dead.
Well, that's a zombie one. I was thinking of a vampire.
Oh, vampire. Underworld series.
Okay, yeah. There's a number of popular culture expressions of both, and I'm such an old fuddy-duddy. I'm talking about 1930s movies, and I can't even remember, one of the classics out there.
Oh, the it's for the young adults.
Yes. Help us. Our audience anyone in our audience below the age of 30 is extremely frustrated with us right now.
Yeah, it's she plays Joan Jett in the rock the rock documentary of the Runaways.
Yeah,
that's how bad I am with.
Yeah.
I don't know what's the vampire name.
Well, maybe it'll come to us, but we've had all of these sort of like popular culture iterations of vampires and zombies, and I think they're still somewhat salient in our world today.
Well, I think it's like the superheroes. They offer vehicles for extreme versions of normality.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think of vampires, What We Do in the Night, right? Which is probably my favorite vampire movie because it's mundane.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's
What We Do in the Shadows. You mean?
Yeah, What We Do in the Shadows.
Comedy.
Yeah.
Shout out to Lori Donna, who's probably listening. That's one of her favorite movies.
Oh, it's really fun. But then there's those moments of extreme violence in it because obviously you can't be a pacifist vampire.
Yeah, certainly. So they're still very salient, but I've always thought that they're coded in really interesting popular culture ways. Like, I think that the zombie and the Walking Dead series and other, I think that they make stronger connections to a masculine ideal and masculine anxieties and fears in our contemporary culture, much more conducive to kind of like militarism and building a survival shelter and the zombie apocalypse coming, a kind of Mad Max world.
The rise of gay rights. I mean, I always think that the fear of gay marriage, gay rights, is literally the fear of the zombie being able to tear your masculine body apart. Right. So a bunch of stuff's going on, in the 2000s. I mean, I think it's, the war on terror can't not be disassociated with that.
Yeah, and that kind of general pervasive terror and fear that masculinity is weakening, draining out of some young man forming an identity in this weird, complicated pop culture world. And they see the threat of the zombies as symbolic of so many of the things that are that threaten their identity. And I think that there is, in this way, like if you are bitten by a vampire, you still maintain a certain identity in a way. But with the threat of the zombie masses, it is the threat of a loss of identity. You no longer are yourself in a sense. And it is a very destabilizing experience. But I think there's a heightened connection there to kind of where culture and where men have gone in American popular culture, the rise of the men's rights movement, the sort of antagonism and fear of feminism.
Yeah, Proud Boys.
Yeah, and this kind of what lies underneath a lot of this is this fear of destabilized identity. And to fight against the zombies is to reclaim some kind of masculine form of violence, right? Where you're like decked out in camo gear and you're in survivalist mode all the way through, and you're driving some Mad Max apocalypse vehicle, and you're felling the masses in a sense. Whereas, and certainly I think there are strong resonances in like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where the vampire culture I think is much more attuned and connected to the same kind of disorientations and fears that young women in particular have in our weird pop culture moment and world. Where vampire culture kind of speaks to that a lot more. What I think young women...
Twilight.
Yes, Twilight, thank you. And now our audience has finally nodded. Yes, the Twilight series, of course, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And there are so many themes of like sexual discovery, threat of sexuality, but sexual discovery as well, and intimacy to the threat of these horrors, and a romantic veneer as well. And I'm not suggesting that these things are necessarily feminine. What I actually am suggesting is that our entertainment industries are well conscious of these codes, and they make money by packaging certain cultural expressions through gendered norms, instantiating and maybe strengthening those gendered identities. But these, I think, I would suggest to you, very conscious sort of cultural expressions and iterations that are trying to reach certain demographics.
Yeah.
In other words, that I speak not from a kind of fixed and essentialist point of view with regards to gender, but rather the ways in which culture industries play upon these things and are well aware of these kinds of articulated forms of identity. But at root here, and this is why I think the horror genre is so important to think about with regards to cultural expression, opposition to mainstream culture and mass culture, et cetera, is because what is the horror genre about? It's about fear. And fear is such an elementary force and the shaping of our identity. We talked about this last week with regards to noir, right? That noir is in some ways the threat of sex and the desire for violence. And that threat and desire are sort of two sides of the same coin.
That's the libidinal, right? Again, it's control, loss of control over sexuality, the loss of gender identities, the loss of, connection.
Yeah, and so going back to Night of the Living Dead, this is a film that touches upon key fears about the American family and the traditional family private sphere. There's an interesting set of paradoxes, however. The victims are boarded up in the house. The house is what protects them, right? But the house is slowly being ripped apart by them in order to be made into a kind of militaristic bunker. I like the idea of...
but they're safe and trapped.
Yes, safe
simultaneously
and trapped at the same time. And that actually is crucial to the dialogue, right? Because the main disagreement in the film is between those who think that they should go even further into the cage, the basement, and those who think they should fight it out up above the surface, right? I think I've always thought it was really interesting that and what was it? Mr. Cooper, right? The Cooper family. Mr. Cooper, and he has this kind of heightened racial tension with the main character, Ben, who's played by Dwayne Jones, who was an NYU film student and just happened to be the best actor who showed up to audition for the part of the main lead protagonist. George Romero and the other members of Image 10 had originally, in writing the script, they were thinking that this was kind of going to be like a white hick dude, like a country dude. And that's how they sort of wrote it. But when Dwayne Jones ultimately was tapped for the part, they didn't change the script at all. They left it completely. It's this weird sort of post-racial, I know that's like a ridiculous concept, but it's like a script in which a black man is going to play the role. And there's nothing in the film that explicitly or intentionally is supposed to evoke his race or any racial tension. Yeah. That all comes out organically, with Mr. Cooper being the main antagonist to Black Dwayne Jones, his black protagonist character, right?
Yeah, Ben. Yeah, or Ben taking down white zombies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's that element as well, but he's also fighting with the kind of traditional Mr. Cooper, the kind of Ozzy from Ozzy and Harriet, sort of like, take you to the moon, Harriet. Yeah. There's that moment
but
you
he's
mentioned.
A silent majority, angry.
Yeah. Nixon voter, suburban, angry, kind of, blue collar maybe, balding white guy with his wife and kid in tow. And they go down in the basement, and he's the one who insists that they further go deeper into the cage, right? And they defend from the basement, and he's so certain. And his wife says, you pointed this out earlier today.
Yeah, it's he's making the argument, and she's like, it's important, isn't it, for you to be right?
Mm-hmm. And there's this moment of defiance, but then she quickly sits
back down. But it's still, there's a lot of interesting things going on in it.
And it culminates into, I think, one of the most powerful symbolic forms of familial destruction in Night of the Living Dead, the consumption of the parents by the daughter, right?
Yes.
She ends up consuming them in the most gruesome way, with a lot of shadow play, heightened sense of music, great editing happening there, some very sharp cuts, right? But the other element that you mentioned too is that Dwayne Jones, our black protagonist, is felling all these white zombies. None of the zombies appear to be anything other than white, right?
And they're in their 50s business attire, so he is literally killing and shooting and Molotov cocktailing white 1950s business attired men.
Mm-hmm. And one of the more overlooked elements of Night of the Living Dead, I've always felt, because I didn't even think about this until viewing it half a dozen times or so, was that Mr. Cooper was actually right about the basement. And Dwayne Jones actually, at the end of the movie, ends up going to the basement, right? He has to kill the daughter, but the basement is the only way in which he survives all the way up until the end of the film and the last shots of the film. And then again, almost organic racial meaning coming out of this film. It's a white-led militaristic posse who ultimately kills Dwayne Jones. Yeah. They think he's a zombie, but he's not. And they shoot him with a sniper rifle.
In 1967, which the year the movie comes out, 1968, you have multiple
the race riots in Watts in 1967. You have the Mlk assassination with a sniper rifle by a white man. I mean, this movie resonates on these levels so profoundly. And what I think is remarkable are all of this deeper textual meaning about race in America is in some ways very organic. It is not consciously crafted by screenwriters or Romero, the director, or anything. I mean, it comes out of a very organic space of the film text. It can't help but resonate along these lines.
And then, I mean, I think the we talked about this earlier with In the Heat of the Night. Yeah. With,
Sidney Poitier.
Striking a white man. It's like one of the first portrayals of that. Yeah. And then here you have Night of the Living Dead, again, showing something that's never been shown before. Yeah. To sort of this white America dealing with a post, at least legislatively, Jim Crow society, which, again, it's when we think of horror, there's that libidinal part that you can't legislate that away. You can't legislate away sort of the deep anti-blackness or the misogyny, right?
I think that the Ben's punching Mr. Cooper in the face multiple times is actually much more powerful and resonates much more in terms of racial meaning than Sidney Poitier and In the Heat of the Night, because that moment in The Heat of the Night, he's in the Deep South, right? He's this Philadelphia detective and cop, and it's sort of a white genteel, the kind of guy who would own slaves, who slaps him with the back of his hand as he would slap any black person in the Deep South and in segregation. And it's Poitier who just slaps back immediately. And that means something, and the tension is there. There were audiences at the time who cheered during that moment. There were also audiences who were outraged in the South. That was a controversial moment in film in 1967. But I think that Night of the Living Dead actually goes a lot further, because it's not like
he humiliates him.
He totally humiliates him and completely cuts him down. And Cooper is also not the stand-in of Southern genteel white slave owning.
No, he's Northern bourgeois respectability.
Yeah, he's Youngstown, Ohio, plumbers union, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it cuts maybe a little bit more sharply on what we might see as mass cultural racial designations. Can we go back to that question? Can art still be oppositional in the triumph of mass culture today?
I almost think that that's an illusion that, academics and intellectuals come up with. Like, if a picture or a piece of art mobilizes people and gets them into the street to, free so-and-so or make this change in government.
Shepherd Ferry.
Yeah, if it does that, then yes. But then, I always think, go back to the 2000s, the early W years. V for Vendetta, that was one of the most radical. I remember walking out of the theater with my brother and just looking around going, it's like, I feel like we weren't supposed to watch that. Like, it seemed too on point and kind of so subversive that someone's taking down our license plate number. But obviously W was reelected and nothing changed. So, I always wonder, how oppositional can culture be if it's being routed through the same consumption channels as something that's more mainstream and status quo?
Well, that's the question. Right? Yeah. That's the question.
Yeah. I have a tough time seeing anything that's too oppositional. Think back to the early 1970s, two films especially that came out, Punishment Park by Peter Watkins and Ivan Dixon's, written by Sam Greenlee, The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Both movies, if you watch them today, I show Punishment Park and students just lean back in their chair as if they're being screamed at. And it's still very powerful. Spook Who Sat by the Door there's no way you could even make that movie today. There's another one, Born in Flames, in '83 that comes out the same situation. But Spook Who Sat by the Door came out, it literally was pulled from the theaters by the FBI. and Sam Greenlee and Ivan Dixon took a copy they had, put a different name on it, and stored it in a vault and walked away.
Mm-hmm.
Punishment Park wasn't as severe, but he had a tough time finding theaters to run it, and it basically was consigned to like college campuses. You know, it's were those super revolutionary? If they were to have not been tampered with, would people have risen up? Like, I just don't. I think it all goes back to what we've been playing with, where a film and art often is an outlet for a life of mundane austerity. And then you go see a movie, and whether it is high culture or low culture, you're trying to find something that connects with that inner component that is deadened through your everyday. So, you know, I think, you know, some people might want to watch an 8-hour Warhol movie and experience that, you know, or I always think of 2001, right? Is that the greatest movie ever made? A lot of people would be, you know, they can't get through the first hour.
Yeah.
Other people,
we had this conversation.
are totally content with getting
Yeah.
through the whole thing, and then it's at the end of it, it's this magical ending.
Yeah.
And so,
It's an incredible and remarkable film. I fully acknowledge it's boring. I also think it could very well be widely regarded as the greatest film ever made in a generation or two. It might supplant Vertigo the way that Vertigo supplanted Citizen Kane. I think it is the likely contender so far because it is just pure cinema. It's cinema perfection. I can't find very little wrong with that film, and it's visually very, very sharp and precise. And yeah, it's boring, of course, but perfection is not always supposed to be entertaining.
yeah, but it means so much to so many different people.
Yeah.
And it's
Also an interesting movie that comes out in this time period, a night time period, 2001, 68, I believe. An interesting film that did really, really well. It made money. Now, everyone was worried about this movie. Arthur C. Clarke did not like what Kubrick was doing. MGM was trying to take it away from him. At the very last moment, he had it in the can. They released it. It was, of course, very famously a 70 millimeter exhibition. It just recently came back, and so I was able to see it on 70 millimeter in Seattle. Just an amazing experience. It's a movie that I think was well fitted for its time. It's counterculture time. It was a movie that was so out there in a way. It fit with the times. I think if that movie would have come out in, say, 1988, it wouldn't have done that well, right? It was a movie that it was ripe for that moment, that late 1960s moment.
Yeah, it's the moment of, you know, the 70s, people become more self-conscious. I think globalization, neoliberalism is a part of that. The moment that information's flowing so fast that the moment something happens, you're already reliving the nostalgia of that moment. Like, and today it's that perfect, like, everyone's, like, I'm surprised you and I aren't doing selfies or taping ourselves doing the radio show to make sure that we can watch the video on our phone of us doing the radio show. Because why would you want to listen to it as the radio? Why not we just tape it ourselves? Or we could have a video camera taping the phone, taping us as we do the radio show. Like, it's
very meta.
But the 2001, I think it works so well because it suddenly gave everyone in 1968 a longue durée, you know, 100,000 year picture of humanity.
Yeah.
At this key, you know, 1968 moment of where's all this going to go?
Yeah. Big existential questions.
Yeah.
Fitted very well. And you're right. And this, I think, is a good segue into making a pitch for next week. Our podcast next week, we're going to talk about the cinema of loneliness. And we're going to focus on these 1970s films in particular, and this turn inward, and this turn toward a kind of isolated individual, if you will. As a lead up to our what we would, I hope, will culminate into a discussion of the Joker. And I think that the Joker, a lot of people have been saying this about the Joker, that it's a film that might have these kinds of political resonances, like a movie of its time that says something about where we are at today. So with that in tow, that was this week's episode of Dr. J's Movie Imaginarium. Thank you all for listening in. And again, next week, we're going to take on the horror genre.